If only you knew how research institutes spent your tax dollars cruelly abusing animals. Wouldn't you want to know? But what if they kept you and the experiments in the dark? Is that even legal? Not yet, but wait till AB 700 passes in California. The urgent fight to stop the start of lab gag laws around the nation. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, you've heard of ag-gag, laws where states protect ag interests from disclosing what they do to animals. Here's a new one, lab gag, which aims to keep the experiments of animal abusers secret.
Access to these records helps facilitate a better understanding of what's happening in these laboratories. And I tell you, that's why they don't like it, because they know that the public gets to learn more about what they're doing. And they know that these tools are effective for PETA and other groups at learning about what's going on and shutting down some of the most egregious forms of abuse. And that's why it's so important that AB 700 be defeated.
Jeremy Beckham, PETA researcher, talking about AB 700, the proposal making its way through the California Assembly right now. If it passes, it would exempt scientists at public institutions from open records requests that would help to expose the cruelty in experiments conducted with your taxpayer dollars. My conversation with Jeremy with the details, but first, thanks again for joining us here at the PETA Podcast. This is episode 65 in our second season of shows. Please share a link with friends. Let them know how the animals have a voice on the PETA Podcast. The latter part of April each year is when the focus turns to the World Week for Animals in Laboratories. Listen to episode 64 for more about what goes on in laboratories and what you can do to stop it all. And there's science and there's mandatory government testing. Find out how PETA has saved millions of lives by forcing science to change their cruel, outdated methods. That's on episode 23. And if you've just found us, welcome. And keep binging. There's lots to listen to on the PETA Podcast. Remember, if you're on Apple Podcasts, don't forget to rate and review the show. It helps the algorithm know that PETA has a podcast on the issues important to you. There's also a link to a survey in our show notes, if you're so inclined, and we'd love to hear your feedback. Now, if you really want to help the animals, you can always hit the Donate Now button at PETA.org. And if you're high-tech and have Amazon's Alexa, it's as easy as saying, Alexa, donate to PETA. And now to our episode. California university and research institutions received more than $2 billion. $2 billion. In 2018 alone from the National Institutes of Health. And more than 50% of that went to animal experiments. What goes on in there? Well, PETA wants to know and has sued to get documents. But now in California, a new proposal, Assembly Bill or AB 700, wants to stop PETA and others from finding out exactly what these researchers do. Just like some states make it hard for the public to find out what ag interests do, the so-called ag-gag laws, this California proposal threatens to spawn lab gag laws around the country, which would put a legal cloak around the work done in research labs and allow for the cruelty to go on without protest. There's time to stop it in California, if you act now, and we'll tell you how. But first, listen to my conversation with PETA's Jeremy Beckham on why stopping California's AB 700 is urgent on the PETA Podcast. Jeremy, lab gag. I know it's derived from ag-gag as a quick shorthand to describe something that's bad that's happening. But so what is lab gag?
Sure. And let me talk just a little bit about where that name comes from, because I do think there's a common denominator here, and that is that industries that abuse animals have to rely on secrecy to thrive. They find time and time again, whether it's, a pig factory farm or an animal laboratory, that as soon as the public starts to learn the details about what they're doing to animals, the tide starts to turn against them. So rather than actually changing their abhorrent practices, they try to control access to information. And that's exactly what's happening with Assembly Bill 700. This is a bill that's in the California State Assembly right now, introduced by Assemblymember Laura Friedman. And it would carve out new, broad, dangerous exemptions in the California Public Records Act for research that is occurring at post-secondary institutions. So these are things like the University of California system, as well as California State University campus locations as well. And what this will do is it will make it almost impossible for groups like PETA and other animal advocacy organizations to request information from these universities about what they're doing to animals inside laboratories. And that's a huge danger.
So right now, you can go to the schools using the California Open Records Act, and they, by law, must produce information that shows what they're doing.
That's right, but I want to also make clear it's not so easy even right now. Even without this change, these universities all fight tooth and nail to release information. So, for example, PETA has a pending lawsuit against the University of California, Davis for videotapes that the experimenters shot themselves of experiments they were carrying out on baby monkeys at this university. These are taxpayer-funded experiments happening at a public institution. We think the public has a right to see those tapes, but the university is refusing to hand them over even under the existing law, and we've taken them to court. What AB 700 will do, though, is it will give them a new tool to refuse to hand over records, because it'll create an explicit exemption in the California Public Records Act for research occurring at a post-secondary institution. And this includes everything to do with the research methods, with any of the data that's generated, with any of the correspondence, which is, one of the most wild exemptions because that's so incredibly broad. So all of this information will be out of the public's grasp, and it'll make it even harder for us to get information from these labs. It's really the wrong direction to be moving in. What we need bills introduced to make these places more transparent, not less. So this is very counterproductive.
And it's really right in tune or right in line with the way that people who don't want scrutiny, they find a legislator who will enact a bill that will specifically exempt a whole area or whole industry from scrutiny. And so in this case, it's the scientists and the researchers? Who's behind this bill in terms of financing and trying to get this through politically?
That's a very good question. And like everything in this country, it can be very difficult to follow all of the dark money that's getting infused in our politics and to find out who's really behind a lot of these legislative maneuvers. Officially, one of the groups that's on record as a sponsor of this legislation is the Union of Concerned Scientists. And they actually sent someone who is a University of California, Santa Cruz professor to testify at the committee hearing in support of the bill. And while he was testifying, he emphasized research he did years and years ago on environmental lead contamination and the threat that poses to the California condor population, which sounds obviously very laudable. I mean, people want to try to protect wildlife. Obviously, PETA does as well. And he emphasized that area of his research. But when we started to dig into what this guy really does, his only current federal grant from the National Institutes of Health is for an experiment on rats, where he's intentionally poisoning them with manganese and then administering the ADHD medication Ritalin to them to see if Ritalin mitigates some of the cognitive impairments caused by manganese. But he didn't mention that at all in his testimony. And I think that that's symbolic of what's going on here. You have on paper, you have, the Union of Concerned Scientists saying this is a threat to academic freedom. But when you really scratch beneath the surface, you see that what this mostly is about protecting animal experimenters from transparency.
And when you found this out about this one experimenter who was testifying and not disclosing, it was kind of a clear bias or a clear conflict of interest.
And not only that, but what that means is that every member on that committee that voted for AB 700 to move it out of committee, they were voting for this bill essentially under false pretexts. In their mind, they're voting to protect research into wild condor populations, not to protect research on giving rats Ritalin. okay, at the University of California, Santa Cruz in a laboratory. That's a false narrative that these people are putting forward in the assembly. And what's really so frightening about this all is how quickly it's moving through. So these falsehoods are being spread through the California Assembly and already getting up or down votes in committees before we even have an opportunity to debunk them. And, PETA is working as quickly as we can, as well as a lot of other organizations that have come out to oppose this bill. And there really is a pretty broad coalition now, not just animal groups, who oppose AB 700. But this juggernaut is proceeding so quickly. It already has an appropriations committee hearing this Wednesday. They were urging people right now, especially if you're a California resident, call your assembly member, call the members of the appropriations committee, urge them to vote against AB 700. The time is right now for action on this.
And so, once again, it's called lab gag because it would put a gag on whom, and how would that be negative?
Really, it would put a gag on all of us. It put a gag on taxpayers, on the public, because you have the right, I have the right, PETA has the right. We all have the right to know how our government is conducting its business. And I can promise you one of the first things that's going to happen if God forbid, AB 700 becomes law, one of the first things that's going to happen is some group, and it may be PETA, we'll have to see, but some group is going to file a lawsuit against the bill, against this new law, because the right to have access to information about how your government's operated is actually enshrined in the California state constitution. And the reason it's enshrined in the California Constitution is because democracy only works when the public is well informed. We have to have a shared understanding of facts and information about what our government is actually doing in order to participate in the democratic process.
So people would say, look, does that really affect our ability to participate in democracy if we don't hear about what an experimenter does?
You have to realize that transparency is really a key ingredient of accountability. I mean, if the public and by extension the media as well is not able to even learn about what our government is doing with our tax money, then we're not able to comment on that. We're not able to demand changes. We're not able to expose fraud and abuse. So dangerous about this is that the experimenters in these laboratories will know this. They will know as soon as AB 700 is passed, if heaven forbid it is passed, that that's essentially a blank check for them to do whatever they want with impunity, because no one will ever be able to learn what they're doing to animals in laboratories. So they'll be able to carry out some of the most controversial and cruel experiments you can imagine, knowing full well that the public will never even learn what's happening. And it has to be emphasized here, we're talking about taxpayer-funded experiments happening at a public institution. So that person, for example, who testified on behalf of University of California, Santa Cruz in favor of AB 700, that experiment where he's poisoning rats with manganese, he's receiving $570,000 a year from the NIH every year for that experiment. I think that taxpayers have a legitimate right to weigh in on how their money is used, because every single time the government expends our money, expends taxpayer funds, there are opportunity costs associated with that. So because we're funding rat poisoning at the University of California, Santa Cruz, we can actually quantify. This means that so many low-income children will no longer have access to quality education. Or this means that people will no longer have access to healthcare, so many people. And so in order for us to even have these kinds of decisions about these kinds of societal trade-offs, we need to have a basic understanding of what the government's doing. And when we don't have that, we're kind of lost at sea. We're all just making up our own conspiracy theories about what the government's doing. It encourages, the dissemination of nonsense and fake news, things like that. And I think it's really harmful for democracy for the government to keep increasing the scope of the programs it carries out that are secretive and beyond the reach of transparency laws. It's a huge danger to democracy.
With this knowledge, we can say where we're properly or improperly allocating our funds. If the resources are not unlimited, we need to know this information. So that's important. But now these Open Records Act, they're no different from the Freedom of Information Act. The Freedom of Information Act is federal. Could you not get this information in another way on a federal level?
Federal Freedom of Information Act only applies to federal agencies and the records that those agencies are the custodian of. So we should be able to get some very basic information like the NIH grant applications. But there's a whole other host of records that we won't be able to get because the NIH doesn't keep those records. These are things like photographs and videos of the experiments themselves. These are things like veterinarian health records for the animals or the animal use protocol. That's a big one. This is basically the written plan that the experimenter spells out for what they want to do to animals and why they want to do it. And they have to submit this protocol to an oversight committee called an IACUC that approves or rejects the experiments. And PETA routinely obtains these protocols, and we find deficiencies in them all the time. It could be that they didn't consider an alternative that's out there. Maybe they don't even know it exists, or they're refusing to adopt that alternative. Or I'll give you one other clear-cut example. We had a pretty well-known case of a cat experiment at UW-Madison several years ago. And the experimenter who experimented on these cats, one of whom was named Double Trouble. I encourage everyone to go out and Google Double Trouble UW-Madison. You'll find our video about this case. And a lot of the details in that video were procured from records we got through a state records request, okay? Including the fact that the experimenter said that his justification for using and killing cats in that experiment was to ensure their constant source of funding and publication record. So they were carrying out this hideously cruel and worthless experiment and justifying on the grounds that they were receiving grant money for doing it. Now, I think that the public has a right to see that, to learn that justification, and then weigh in on whether or not they're okay with that. And I think overwhelmingly, people are not okay with the thought of torturing and killing animals in laboratories, literally just so you can get grant money, which is what they said here. So access to these records helps facilitate a better understanding of what's happening in these laboratories. And I tell you, that's why they don't like it, because they know that the public gets to learn more about what they're doing. And they know that these tools are effective for PETA and other groups at learning about what's going on and shutting down some of the most egregious forms of abuse. And that's why it's so important that AB 700 be defeated.
What is the fear, Jeremy, that this AB 700 could spread to other states?
Well, we know that animal experimenters all around the country really fear transparency. PETA has pending lawsuits right now against laboratories all around the country, really. We have one against Oregon Health Sciences University, one against University of Massachusetts Amherst, the one against UC Davis I mentioned. We have a dispute with the University of Utah as well. And I'm sure all of these places would love to get their legislatures to just write a new law that makes us go away and gets us off their back. And, most people who follow state politics pretty closely will tell you that if California or New York pass a law, it's pretty common to see that law propagate all over the place. So these states are particularly dangerous, but really it's dangerous whenever any state passes a law, because the proponents of that law will use that as momentum to try to get their agenda passed in other states. And so that's one of the things we're worried about here, is that if California is the first domino to fall, it may make it harder to find out what's happening in laboratories and states all over the country.
And compare that with how, if this happens with lab gag, how did ag gag spread? And what's a similar analogous situation there?
A lot of state legislators belong to these associations like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, where they all get together from time to time and kind of share their notes about what they passed. And we know that ag gag was one of these kinds of ALEC laws. So you saw Iowa pass an ag gag law, and then not long after, Utah passed an ag gag law, Missouri passed an ag gag law. I think some other states too that just escape me right now. So once they see one of them do it, it kind of becomes a model for other states to do that same thing. So that's why it's so important that we stop this right now, draw a line in the sand and say, no, taxpayer-funded research is not off limits to state transparency laws in any state in this country. We're not going to create a new law where California animal experimenters get to keep their information secret, and then other states, they don't either. And so it's so important that we stop this train from rolling out of the station right away.
PETA researcher Jeremy Beckham on California's AB 700, the proposal that, like the ag-gag laws around the country, would allow animal abusers to be exempt from open record laws and effectively shut out public scrutiny. To take action, go to PETA.org or go to the links in the show notes to send the message to legislators to stop California's AB 700. Let them know that secrecy and animal cruelty has no place in our democracy. To stop California's AB 700, go to PETA.org now. And that's our program for today. Hey, you can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on amok.com, AMOK.com. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. And don't forget, you can help the animals and PETA, especially if you have Amazon's Alexa. Just say, Alexa, donate to PETA. Our music is provided by CarbonWorks. Check them out on YouTube. Thanks for listening. Join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.